Hello, and welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto, attorney at law in the state of Michigan, where I'm practicing law now for 24 years in the fields of consumer protection and lemon law. I often write about this stuff for places like Jalopnik, Opposite Lock, and Road and Track. Today's topic is turbine cars, wings, and tuckers. And careful listeners of my show or people who watch my videos know that once in a while I mention I may have written a book or two, and I've written books on all of these cars, turbine cars, wings, and tuckers. So we'll talk about cars today, cars I know a lot about, cars that are really, really cool. So for instance, Chrysler's turbine car. In fact, you look over my right shoulder, there's a Chrysler's turbine car model right there. And this book, of course, has a foreword by Jay Leno because Jay Leno's got a turbine car. But a lot of people don't know that Chrysler was building turbine cars in 1953 and building them well into the 80s. So for over 30 years, Chrysler was building jet-powered cars, experimenting with this technology, and they got very, very far with it. But the height of the program was probably reached when they built a fleet of 55 cars in 1963 and lent them to the public. So if you've ever seen a turbine car that looks like the one over my shoulder here, that was part of the program where they built these cars, lent them to the public as part of a big publicity stunt. And for a couple of years, these cars were everywhere. You could get a car for 3 months from Chrysler if you entered the drawing and they picked your name. And I interviewed a bunch of people who had these cars. It was pretty cool. They got to drive the cars around like a daily driver. Just put gas in it and drive it. Car would run on any liquid that burned. You couldn't put leaded gas in it, but you could put diesel, kerosene, home heating oil. And they did demonstrations, in fact, with tequila and hairspray, peanut oil. I mean, these things would run on any liquid that burned. But unfortunately, the program got killed because they couldn't tool up to build the cars. Commercially, it would cost a lot of money. And the cars didn't have great tailpipe emissions, and tailpipe standards were coming in the 70s and 80s. And of course, Chrysler ran into financial trouble as well. But of the 55 cars that were built, 46 of them were destroyed due to a complex law regarding imports and so on. I explain it all in the book. And 9 of them survive to this day. Most of them are in museums, but for instance, Jay Leno owns one, and also a car collector in Indiana owns one as well. Jay Leno let me drive his. And trust me, I was driving around in Burbank, California on a Saturday afternoon at the wheel of Jay Leno's turbine car. It's a neat experience. On the one hand, I'm driving down the road and people's heads are whipping around to see what's coming because they can hear this, what sounds like either a low-flying jet or a gigantic nuclear-powered vacuum cleaner coming their way. And then, of course, they'd say, oh, it's a cool car, and there's Jay Leno in the passenger seat, and they'd wave, and I'd honk. And it's a lot of fun. But, of course, I was terrified the whole time thinking, what if I'm the guy who's at the wheel of this car when someone runs a red light and T-bones us? I'd go down in history as the guy who was driving when Jay Leno's turbine car got wrecked. But that didn't happen, so I'm very, very happy. I got to drive his car, and he wrote the foreword to my book, Chrysler's Turbine Car, The Rise and Fall of Detroit's Coolest Creation. And he talks about how he first saw one of these cars at the New York World's Fair as a child, and he grew up always thinking to himself, someday I'd like to own one of those cars. And he's one of the few people who could ever actually say, yes, and I do own one now. Now, another cool car, and again, this is over my other shoulder, that's Bobby Isaac's Dodge Daytona. And I wrote a book called Dodge Daytona and Plymouth Superbird, Design, Development, Production, and Competition. These cars are really, really neat if you're into cars, Chryslers, or NASCAR, because this car was a certain turning point in NASCAR. In 1964, Chrysler introduced the Hemi at NASCAR, and the cars now suddenly went very, very fast, I can say 180 miles an hour. And they did this, of course, in a car with the aerodynamics of a shoebox. Go back and look at what cars looked like in 64 and 65. They were not very aerodynamic, and the cars at that speed wanted to do crazy things. I interviewed guys who raced cars doing 180 miles an hour when the car wouldn't want to turn, for instance. You're going towards a curve at 180, you start letting off the gas a little bit, you turn left, the car wants to go straight. That's not a good thing. So the guys came back to Chrysler and said, guys, you got to do something, these cars are dangerous. And so horsepower won't solve that problem. What solves the problem is aerodynamics. So Chrysler actually had a missile division in the 60s helping put like Redstone rockets into the sky. And a bunch of the guys from that department got laid off, and one of them named John Pointer went to work for Chrysler's automotive division, knew nothing about cars, he told me, and I interviewed him, and he said, but I knew all about aerodynamics. And so when he was met with a guy from Chrysler Racing, he said, how do you make our cars go faster? He said, well, I was thinking like a rocket scientist. I said, put a big nose cone on it and put a wing on the back for more downforce. And he drew this out on a napkin, and I've seen the napkin drawing, and it's fascinating that those are the first two thoughts he had. And the guy from Chrysler said, "Are you sure that'll make a car go fast?" He goes, "Absolutely. In fact, it's much more efficient and easier to do than putting more horsepower into that car." So he said, "Go do it." They sent him to the Chelsea Proving Ground. And I interviewed guys who were at the Chelsea Proving Grounds while they were working on this, mocking up nose cones and wings and putting them on chargers to make them go faster. And then when they got a design they liked, they tested in a wind tunnel. And eventually they came up with a design for the Dodge Daytona. And at that time, homologation rules in NASCAR only required them to build 500 of a car and sell them to the public for it to be considered a stock car. So they built 503 Dodge Daytonas, sold them to the public. They raced them in NASCAR starting in the fall at the Talladega 500. The race was won by Dodge Daytona. Not Bobby Isaac. Bobby Isaac finished back a few places, but Richard Brickhouse won. It was a strange race, though, because the Professional Drivers Association had gone on strike, and a lot of the big-name drivers like Richard Petty didn't drive in the race. But in 1969, Petty was not driving for Chrysler because when he saw the Dodge Daytona, he asked Plymouth, "Hey, you guys going to build me a wing car?" And Plymouth said, "No, go out and race a Roadrunner." And Richard Petty said, "I can't compete against a wing car." So he went to Ford because Ford had more aerodynamic cars at the time. So in 1970, Plymouth built a Superbird specifically to bring Richard Petty back to their fold to race their cars in NASCAR 1970. Now, 1970 NASCAR required a few more cars to be built than the year before. And so they had to build 1,920 Plymouth Superbirds, which they built and sold to the public, again, to make the car stock. And then the cars got raced in NASCAR. In 1970, you saw a full year of cars being raced with wings and nose cones, and quite a few of them won the big races. In fact, Pete Hamilton, who's driving for Richard Petty, won a couple of big races that year in a Petty Blue Superbird, but it was not Richard Petty's own car. It was just the other car on the team. The first car to ever do a 200-mile-per-hour lap at a NASCAR track sanctioned by NASCAR was a Dodge Daytona. Likewise, Bobby Isaac took his car out and did a 201 shortly thereafter. And then in 1971, when the cars got outlawed, Bobby Isaac and the K&K guys went to Bonneville Salt Flats, and they set a bunch of world land speed records in a stock-bodied car, including one which was a flying mile at over 216 miles per hour, which is really fast in a stock-bodied car with a carbureted engine. And likewise, I interviewed a bunch of guys who were there for that. It's a pretty cool experience to set all those world records in a Dodge Daytona. Now, they only built 503 Dodge Daytonas, about 1,920 of the Superbirds. If you can find one today, they're often worth six figures. They've actually had one sell close to $1 million. A friend of mine sold a four-speed Hemi Dodge Daytona at a Mecum auction about a year ago. And with the buyer's premium and the auctions fees and all that, was extremely close to $1 million. Not quite $1 million, but close to it. So those cars are worth a lot of money. I do have to dispel one myth, and this will cause a lot of people to get upset. But the big wing over the deck lid on this car right here, that was not put there so the trunk can open. And people will get upset when I say this, and I don't care because I'm right. I interviewed the guy who put the wing there. It was John Pointer. And I asked John Pointer, "John, why did you put the wing so high?" And he said, "For clean air. That's up, put it up in the clean air." I said, "Well, could you put it lower?" And he said, "I don't know. We probably could have, but my first thought was, how high do I have to put it for clean air?" I said, "Well, what about this thing people always say it's there for the trunk to open?" And he goes, "Who cares about the trunk?" He goes, "I wasn't thinking about the trunk. I want the car to go fast." So the guy who put the wing there said specifically he put it there simply to put it in clean air. Now, I can tell you that about 1 year ago, I sat down face-to-face with Richard Petty and interviewed him for a documentary I'm working on. And when we were done filming, we got up and we were walking around one of his cars at his shop there in North Carolina. And we stopped by the wing, and I said, "You know, Richard, one of the reasons I love these cars is they're just so in your face. This big wing and that big nose cone are just daring you. They're just staring you in the face. They're just daring you to race, you know?" And he goes, "Do you know why they put the wing up this high?" And now I'm thinking to myself, I can't argue with the king. So I go, "How about this?" I go, I think so. What do you think?" And he goes, "Clean air." And I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Have you heard people say that they did it for the trunk to open?" He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "But they're wrong." So if you want to argue with me about this, you're not just arguing with me, you're arguing with the guy who put the wing there, and you're arguing with Richard Petty. Take your pick. So the wing was not put there for the trunk to open. The NASCAR rules didn't require the trunks to open. That's silly. So I'm just trying to dispel a myth there. I know people won't believe me, but you can't correct everything in the world. And then that's Dodge Daytona and Plymouth Superbird. Design, development, production, and competition. I got photographs in the book. There's hundreds of beautiful photographs. Photographs in the book of the models being mocked up, of the wind tunnel tests being conducted, also of the Charger 500, which was the interim car they built before the Daytona, where they solved a couple of the aerodynamic problems, but not all of them. And in fact, some people would point out that the Charger 500 might even be rarer than the Dodge Daytona. It's just not as collectible because it's not as cool. It doesn't have the nose cone and the wing. But it's a pretty rare, unusual car. I remember back in the 70s seeing one in traffic and going, yeah, it's an interesting looking car. It had a weird grill on the front. It had a little 500 on the back. At the time, I didn't really know what it was, but I know now, and they're worth a lot of money likewise. Finally, Preston Tucker and his battle to build the car of tomorrow. This is the most recent book I've written, and this book is a fascinating story. Many people have seen the movie starring Jeff Bridges, Preston Tucker, the man in the dream, and quite frankly, the movie's not bad, but the movie glosses over some stuff, and because it's Hollywood, they kind of got to jam a lot of stuff in there. But in 1947 and 46, there was a car shortage in America. During the war, the U.S. government told auto manufacturers, stop building cars, start building war munitions. Army tanks, airplanes, trucks, Jeeps, and so on. But no civilian cars were built for a couple of years. So there was a car shortage during the war and shortly thereafter. So Preston Tucker was a well-known car guy. He'd bought and sold a lot of cars. And he announced he's going to start his own car company. And in fact, his car was going to be brand new from the ground up. Rear engine, rear wheel drive, not based on anything from before the war. He's going to try to put as many innovations into it as he could. He was hoping to put things like disc brakes and fuel injection into it. That stuff didn't come to pass, but he did get a car company started. He raised close to $20 million doing an IPO, and then he got his car company started in Chicago, and they started manufacturing cars. And right around the time the car company started, producing cars, a rumor got leaked that the feds were investigating Tucker for being a fraud. And it turns out that the government itself leaked the information to the public, to the press, and it wound up destroying Tucker. And among other things, it's an interesting story to understand what the government can do to you by regulating you right out of business. But Tucker, they had built 47, 50 cars, depending on how you count them, and they put Tucker and his entire management team on trial in Chicago in federal court. And they basically put them all on trial for a variety of things, including mail fraud and so on. And they accused them of this vast conspiracy of fraud, and they spent months prosecuting the case. And at the end of the prosecution's case, the prosecution stood up and said, Your Honor, we rest. The defense then stood up and said, Your Honor, we rest also. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for 24 years. I'm here to tell you that that never happens. It never happens that the defendants literally say, we're not putting on a defense. Let's go straight to the jury on this. Most cases, the defendants will ask the court to throw the case out due to a lack of material, lack of evidence to convict. But if the judge denies that motion, most defendants put on a defense. Because if you don't, you're waiving your right to a defense. And if you lose, you go to jail. You don't get a second chance. And Preston Tucker and his co-defendants and their attorneys were so confident that they had done nothing wrong and that the prosecution had put in nothing that could possibly be the basis for a conviction, said, we're not even going to bother defending ourselves. Literally, go straight to the jury right now, let them decide. Closing arguments, the jury came back not guilty. All defendants, all counts, not guilty. They had done nothing wrong. The problem is it destroyed the company. The bad publicity, the fact that Tucker was tied up in court for months, wound up ruining the company, and the company never recovered. It was forced into bankruptcy. Preston Tucker wound up trying to start some other projects, but he wound up dying of lung cancer just a couple years later. So we don't know. Would Preston Tucker's car company have actually gotten large enough to compete with the big three? We don't know. We don't know. But the interesting thing is we'll never know because the government shut him down. And that's exactly what happened. The government shut him down. They basically prosecuted him out of business, but in many respects, they regulated him out of business. And it was bad publicity. We even know who did it. It was a guy named Harry McDonald at the SEC who leaked the stuff to the press. He later said, yeah, I leaked it to the press. It was illegal to do it, but I don't care. He just said, yeah, I thought I was protecting investors, which is silly because he basically caused all the investors to lose their money. That's what the government is doing for you. They're protecting you by causing you to lose all your money and causing you to go out of business if you're a big company trying to take on another big business in America. So Preston Tucker, tried for fraud, found not guilty. Meanwhile, one of his cars today sold recently for $2.38 million at an auction. There's 47 of them left. They're all highly collectible if you know where one is. Actually, we know where they all are. And they're worth a lot of money. And like I said, very, very collectible. Very, very cool cars if you see them today. It's got the Cyclops headlight. It's the one car, I don't have a model behind me, but one of these days I'll get one just to add to the collection. But again, that's Preston Tucker and his Battle to Build the Car of Tomorrow, written by me with a foreword by Jay Lehto. He hasn't got one yet, but I suspect one day he might. As with all my books, any book, if I mention it on this show, feel free to email me directly. I'll hook you up for less than Amazon charges. I'll sign it and I'll mail it to you anywhere in the U.S. for less than Amazon charges. It's Lehto at Kennan.com, L-E-H-T-O at Kennan.com. That's Turbine Cars, Wings, and Tuckers. One other thought. I know that you watch me on YouTube know that I'm always wearing a different solid colored t-shirt. Occasionally I wear a shirt that's got a little logo right here. If you have a company that's got a shirt with a logo on it that might look good on me, send me a note. I'll talk to you about it. Maybe I'll wear your shirt on my podcast. As long as it's not obscene, okay? And as long as it looks good on me. I prefer solid colors for the videos. Any questions or comments, shoot my way, lehtoslaw.com, Lehtoslaw.com. I'm on Twitter, at Steve Lehto, at S-T-E-V-E-L-E-H-T-O. And of course, this show's on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podbean, Google Play, and YouTube. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye-bye.